It is a tradition of ours, as our family gets ready to go on vacation, that I go to a special jar in my closet that I've been keeping all year long. This is a jar that I put pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters, whatever loose change I have in my pocket, it goes in this jar. And I don't touch it. I don't think Fran touches it, but I don't touch it all year long. And then the day before we leave, I take it to the bank and pour it in one of those coin counters, and I get enough money for maybe a couple of tanks of gas, maybe a night out or two. It's just like a little bonus money. You know, when I pour all the coins in, you do it all at once, it's kicking out coins that are really not coins, like Chuck E. Cheese tokens and a guitar pick and, Canadian quarters and dimes and things like that. But this time around, a very interesting thing happened. It kicked out a quarter, a U.S. mint quarter, but not the kind of quarter that you probably have in your pocket. A solid silver quarter. Remember those? And not that are filled with copper and nickel that you can see the little, little traces of along the edge of the quarter. I'm talking about a real silver quarter. For whatever reason, it kicked out. And I realized that I had something special there. It would spend just like 25 cents would, but it was worth far more. It would be something that I would never actually put in currency. I would never spend it. I would keep it as a prized possession for the rest of my life. Now, I could not help but think of that little experience, a little anecdote, when I came across this passage here that was just read to you. Because it's filled with quarters and nickels and dimes and half dollars and dollars. I mean, it is a rich passage, but there's one passage, one verse, one thought that you'll never want to give away. You want to take this of your own. You'll find it in verse 28. We'll get to it in just a moment. But I want you to sort of imagine that what you have here in verse 26 through 30 is just a pile of change, but buried in there is something that is absolutely the purest of the pure in its idea of what it tries to convey. So with that in mind, let's look now at the Scriptures and let the Scriptures teach us. We're at verse 26, and if you've been following along week by week, Paul is picking up a theme that he left off with last week about suffering, and he makes this statement. He says, likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. And then he says something that everyone here will understand. This is one of the most self-evident verses in the Bible. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know what to pray for as we ought. But the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. You know exactly what he's talking about. That thought that you just had when you get the news from the doctor and you don't know what to say, you don't know what to pray. Or you get that phone call on a Friday afternoon that the boss wants to see you and you know that layoffs are coming. You don't know what to say. All you feel deep inside is a groaning, a moaning, a wordless sigh. Oh. Or a friend of yours, a peer, tells you something about your teenager. Or you're a teenager and you hear your parents sit down with you and say, there's something we need to tell you and it's not going to be good. We love you both, but we don't love each other anymore. That feeling that you have, that wordless, deep down, Paul says, that's a prayer. It's a prayer direct from the Spirit of God which is in you. When you don't know how you ought to pray, when you are clueless or wordless, all you know is that you have emotion and depth that you want to pray, the Spirit of God works in you to pray. And the reason the Spirit of God can work in you to pray is because you have received the Holy Spirit as at your conversion. Assuming. And this goes back to what Jesus did with his disciples. Do you remember the day of his resurrection? That evening, Jesus and his disciples are in this upper room. And in a very intimate setting, Jesus goes to his disciples and he breathes on them, and he says, receive the Holy Spirit. He breathes on them. Can you imagine a more intimate gesture of the transference of the Spirit of Jesus into the disciples? Now, assuming an experience like that has happened and you weren't holding your breath, the Spirit of God is in you. And when you come to those moments in life when you have no words, the Apostle Paul is saying, don't worry about it. There are times in life when you have no words, and you just sit at the end of the bed, or you're sitting in a traffic light talking to the doctor, or you're at your desk at work thinking about how you got to go in and face your boss, any of these things, and you just don't have words. You just go, oh. Paul says that's a prayer. The Spirit of God, in fact, his words are much better than mine. Listen to what he says. For we do not know what to pray as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. And he, that is God, who searches hearts, knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. There's a picture that you have in your mind of a Bible event. Whether you've read the story deeply or not, you know you have it. And it is that story in the garden of Jesus. The day before his crucifixion, after the establishment, the institution of the Lord's Supper, Jesus goes to a rock, and he kneels at the rock, and it's a stone's throw away from the rest of the disciples. And he says, Abba, Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not what I want, but what you want. 15 seconds of prayer. But he's there for an hour or two, long enough for the disciples to fall asleep. What else was said? Probably nothing. Probably just those deep groanings and moanings, those wordless sighs, where you have the Son who is in agony for what he's to face. You have the Spirit of Jesus in Jesus, interceding for Jesus through these groans and moans to the Father. So you have the perfect picture of the Holy Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in communion. And Paul says, you have that. You have access to that kind of power if the Spirit of God is in you. Because after that experience happened, Jesus says, okay, rise, let's go. Let's face the future. Here come my betrayers, he says. And in that hour, or in those moments of wordless groanings and moanings and sighs, too deep for words, the Spirit ministers to us. And many of you can take solace in that. Because you face things, or you will face things, or you're facing things now. You don't know the words. Don't worry about the words. Just let the Spirit come and minister deep within. And pray in connection to the Father. Intercede for you. So Paul then moves to an amazing line. And this is the coin. This is the pure silver coin of this pile of change here. The coin that actually has two sides to it. And I want to read it to you, verse 28. He says, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. Would you read that with me? And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. So this first statement in this gem, this pure silver coin, is that there's something in store for those who love God. So the question becomes, do you love God? Note what he doesn't say for those who believe God. He doesn't say that. A lot of people believe God. In fact, in the United States, 95% of this population in the U.S. believes in God. 88%, according to George Gallup, 88% of the world believes in God. But so very few people love God. James, the brother of Jesus, picks this up in the epistle of James. He says, so you believe in one God? Good. Big deal. The devil believes in one God, and he shudders. There's something else here. The question is, do you love God? And that's not a question I can answer of you. It's not a question of whether I've been right all my life or done exact things or been sinless in my life. I'm not saying any of that because none of us would qualify. But at the end of the day, regardless of what you've done in your life, what your past is, what you're engaged in right now, do you love God? Is the question that comes out of verse 28. You see the difference, don't you? I mean, loving God is a way of perceiving what happens in God's world that people who don't love God don't see. The Bible gives us an absolute perfect portrait of this in Judas and Peter. Both followed Jesus. Both believed in God. Both were with him to see the kind of miracles that we would want to see. Actually, both betrayed Jesus, didn't they? Judas betrayed Jesus to the soldiers that actually arrested Jesus, and Peter betrayed Jesus to the maidservant and the soldier and the one other man by the fire on Thursday night. The same kind of things. They've all betrayed Jesus. They both believe in Jesus. But to one, Judas, he is condemned to eternal hell. And Peter is given the keys of the kingdom. Why? Because Peter loved God. Not because he was right all the time or sinless all the time or didn't make tragic mistakes. It's because he loved God. Judas loved money. His whole life was oriented around that idol of money. So do you love God? I can't answer that for you, but I suspect you do. I can feel it up here, by the way. God's people singing and praising him. I can see on this Labor Day weekend when many of you maybe had soccer engagements or other things that you've come here because you love God. The bookstore people are telling me that you're buying Bibles, this new Bible that we have. You have to love what he writes. Do you love God? Many, many people do. But Paul says, okay, so for those who love God, and then he goes to the end of that line, he says, and for those who are called according to his purpose, which is an interesting way. It's kind of the way of saying, if you love God, let me tell you something, you love God because you were called to love him. Don't think for a moment, Paul would say, that you have somehow figured this out on your own, that you woke up one morning and said, I'm going to love God today. I'm going to get my act together and I'm going to change, I'm going to be converted. I've investigated everything and I've decided that it's time for me to become a Christian. That's not the way it works. Jesus says, you chose me because I chose you. John says, we love him because he first loved us. The way this works, friends, is that the reason you love God is because God has revealed himself to you.
We thank you for joining us online. The ministries of Christ Church Plano are made possible by generous contributions from our members and viewers. If you have found this sermon meaningful and would like to make a gift of support, please visit christchurchplano.org/give. Thank you.